see out there in the industry. So it's important again to understand what's going on. Less handling in food. In competitions we'll see now, in the 80s in particular, there's lots of constructed food. And you have to be a little bit careful how you handle it. It's a really interesting ways of preparation and presentation. Good sauces are a key, particularly in a live kitchen. In a static kitchen, you don't necessarily taste the food, particularly in Sri Lanka, where you might have judged 101 entries in one section, and you knew they were setting up at 3 o'clock in the morning outside. So you don't really taste a lot of the static or cold kitchen, but in a hot kitchen, you're always tasting, and the sauces are a big part of that. So good sauces are important. The food needs to be quite straightforward, and also that the competitors need to have mastered all of the techniques. If they've got a different technique and they haven't pulled it off, they're probably going to lose marks for that. So they have to master their techniques. And even if their technique is just to braise something properly, that's got to be mastered correctly. So this, I think, is, I'm not just going to say this is important because it's on the exam, but I think this is probably the most important thing we need to think about as a judge, that we have obligations. First of all, we have a big obligation to the competitor. Again, I'm repeating myself saying that they've put a lot of time into it. They're probably trying to get a resume together, a portfolio together so they can get that big job. They may have trained for Nestle Golden Chef's Hat competition for 3 months. Put a hell of a lot of work into it, worked with their chef instructor, and they've done the competition. So we've got a obligation to that competitor, because that could be, without sounding silly, a life-changing moment for that kid or that team. Those 2 students for the Golden Chef's Hat competition win about a $5,000, $10,000 scholarship and go overseas, or the Terry Marks is another one where they get an opportunity to go overseas. So our obligation is to the competitors that we judge them fairly and correctly. We have an obligation to WACS, because they've set out their sort of international guidelines, and we have, which again flows down to the competition organisers. The cookery profession, we have an obligation that we keep moving forward the industry and making sure that we're judging things correctly, so that we're sort of fulfilling it. Most of you are probably aware of the Nestle Golden Chef's Hat competition. We start tomorrow in Melbourne. So I'll fly home at 6 o'clock tomorrow to judge, so I'll make sure I get well rested tonight. But that starts tomorrow, and Nestle go to all of the states in Australia, and they provide the ingredients, and they provide all the media and everything. So they've spent a hell of a lot of money to make this competition a good competition. So if we do something that's not right, or we give an opportunity to, put the competition into disrepute in some way, then that sponsor, may lose out on all that money. So in a lot of competitions, particularly when we do fine foods in Melbourne, we make sure that the judges are from different states. And we also usually bring a judge over from South Africa or from Singapore, so that no one can say, oh, those judges all knew George Koombara, so they gave him the best mark. So you have an obligation to the sponsors to make sure that their money is well spent, because Fonterra spend a hell of a lot of money, Nestle spend a lot of money. It might be also just Relay Equipment, who put in $5,000 to help sponsor the competition. Not a lot of money in the scheme of things, but a lot of money to them, and they want to get a good bang for their buck. So they want the competition to be a good competition. So I think obligations, we need to always consider the obligations, and that's one of the main things as a judge. Okay, following the criteria. The criteria is a list of rules that the organisers would have put together. Normally the organisers would have put that criteria booklet together from help from other states, if it originally would have come from WACS. So it would come from WACS, and they're the standard rules. And judges need to make sure that they're following it, and you need to check that the competitor's following it as well. So one of the first sort of questions you're doing as a judge when you're judging the entry is, saying have these guys followed the criteria, and then am I following the criteria? So make sure that I think I might talk about this a little bit further, but normally to make sure all the judges are on the same page, so to speak, is I will send out the judges pack about 2 weeks before via email. Also, when they get to their hotel room, there'll be on their bed, there'll be a pack with the criteria, all the information when the dinners are, that, you know, for that week, where they have to be, what they've got to do. But the criteria is all there, so they've had it 2 or 3 weeks before via email. They get a hard copy in their hotel room or when they come into the judge's briefing, so that the judges are expected to read that criteria and make sure that they're judging by it. In Perth, they have a really good system where they put the entries up for the day and they pull out the criteria and stick it on a wall where the judges all sort of meet and work around to taste and do whatever, so that they will be able to physically see that criteria all the time. And if you're judging section A1, that criteria will be highlighted for where those sort of chefs are. So it's obviously important that you're judging to the criteria and that the competitor has worked to the criteria. How long should I view an entry? How long do we look at food when we go to a fancy restaurant?
Too long.
Eh?
Too long.
Usually too long for most of us chefs, but it's still not that long. We'll look at something and we'll study it and then we'll get into it. Same thing as a judge, the more you look at it, the more mistakes you're going to pull out of it. But you look at it and be realistic about it, so that you try and match that time that you would normally look at something and tell whether it's good or bad, and then you'll pull it apart a little bit and go further into it. But if we take 20 minutes on each entry and you're in Sri Lanka and you've got 100, and I think one of the biggest days was 103 or something in one entry, we would have been there all day. So we would go on benchmark, and I'll explain what benchmarking is later, and then you sort of just go through. So you don't need to spend 20 minutes on an entry, you need to be sort of realistic about it. Like I said, the more we look at it, the more mistakes we'll find. So we don't want to sort of linger over it too long. Any questions before I offer it along? No? Yep.
Well, just pass on to the rest of the guys.
Mainly to static, but also a little bit in hot kitchen. But what we're talking about benchmarking is we walk into the competition floor and there's 30 entries in 4 main courses served cold, so they're covered in aspect and presented out for the judges to look at. So we would walk up and down the table and we'll pick out the one that just sort of catches our eye as the best one there. Then all the judges will come together and we will judge that. So we'll judge it separately and then we'll talk about it and we'll compare our marks and see if that's our benchmark. From there we can go backwards. Okay, so benchmarking is quite an important thing, and that's where the judges get together and they see which is maybe the highest quality in that entry, and then they'll work backwards. Because like I said, there may not be any gold on that floor. The benchmark might be a silver, might even be a bronze. So you have to try and figure out which is the best one on the floor and then work that out together. And that'll also, when you talk about your marks, see if you're all on the same page as well, if you're all sort of judging well as a team.
Question about that. So that first assessment that you do, that's just based on a visual assumption?
Pretty much a visual, yes, yeah.
Okay. And then you taste?
And, well, in static you don't taste. But in a hot kitchen, it's a little bit hard to benchmark because some of the competitions are over 4 days. So what you would do is you would take photographs of every entry and you would try and benchmark at the end of the day. But with a static, you're not tasting, you're just sort of doing it visual.
Sorry,
Yep.
So what would static be like, for example? Carvings?
Static is all of the cold stuff, so it's your margarine carving, ice carving, anything that's cold. It might be a four-course dinner or a 3-course dinner that's hot food served cold, meaning that it would be normally a plate of hot food, but the header has made it, chilled it all down, covered in aspic so it doesn't dry out, and then it's presented to the judge.
Chocolate carvings and all that will be static.
Yeah, chocolate carvings. We'll talk about judging out of your depth a little bit later too. You guys would never be judging chocolate or margarine, salt dough or anything because that's not your area of expertise. Static judges are a pretty a unique bunch, and we use the guys that really understand that stuff. So if I was to look at sugar modelling or something, I have a reasonable understanding, so I might shadow a judge and work as a junior judge, but I would always, that category would always be judged by an expert in that field. So that's why we do hot kitchens. Yep.
So some static could be prepared 2 or 3 days before, kept in the fridge. So you're not going to taste it.
Usually. Out of your depth, don't judge sectors you're not usually your specialty. So like I said, chocolate, sugar, I might work with Matt McBain, who's a very experienced judge, and learn a lot about it, or Alan Arua from Singapore, and there's a lot about carving, that sort of thing, and shadow him and work as a junior judge and get more experience, but I wouldn't be one of the head judges for that sort of specialty. If you're asked to judge something and it's not, you feel like you're out of your depth, you're better off, because we've got all those obligations, you're better off to put your hand up and say, can you take me out of that somewhere else? There's no shame in it. Or you put your hand up and say, I'd rather be a junior judge and shadow a more experienced judge so I can put in a vote. So if somebody is, we've got a judge on the floor who has said, I don't feel I'm able to judge that, the chairman of judges then has to make the call what to do with that judge. But that would be another rule or another job that the chairman of judges has to do. Even if it's not your area of specialty, and you're working as a junior judge, your opinion might be really, really valid, and you might see something that the other judges don't see. So it's a really valuable thing for everyone concerned, that those people that may feel like they're out of their depth keep going as a junior judge, keep working with it. Okay, static competition. I will hand out the judge's sheet. Very confusing.
I've got the passport already.
Which I'm sure you should plenty of these.
Yeah, you'll get one for me for the Prince competition in Nestle.
Yeah, cool. Password, you been
Normally we're taking 1 mark, half a mark or something. It would have to be a really major mistake. And like not glazing, but like said at the back, you wouldn't keep taking those marks off. It's sort of a one-off. Let's agree to take the marks off. If it's not glazed, if it's a wrong portion, one thing to do when we walk down, we've got a buffet platter for 8. First thing I'm going to do is count the garnishes. It's in the criteria. It says 2 meat with 3 garnishes for each portion of meat. So I'm going to count and 8 on each one. So it's important that the portion, and also that the portion size. So they've got the right amount of portion and the portion size. If it's a buffet platter, which is supposed to be an entree, and then when you take the emu galantine or whatever, and 6 different garnishes, when you look at it, you've got a pattern for 4 people. Obviously, that's not going to work. So all those things would come into portion size, and all that is sort of. So this applies mainly to static, but also a little bit to live. Some of the nitty and gritty of judging, and we've talked a fair bit about a lot of this stuff already, but the things that we're going to think of, the things we're going to consider as a judge, we're going to consider the food styles and the trends, and obviously you need to go to date with that. We're going to consider whether it's a modern thing, or whether it is an old classical, supposed to be a Baron beef or something. If it is, then I need to judge it from, what's our little red book? The Roost or the repertoire, yeah. So if something is presented and it is classical description, all that, the judges need to make sure they're up to date with it, or not up to date, that they can go back and check and judge that accordingly. We don't really tend to see too much of the older style stuff, so everything is more modern. Is it practical? This can be a bit contentious, because in a live kitchen last year, one of the judges was saying, could you do that for 120 people? Wouldn't it be practical? Well, they're not being asked to do it for 120 people, they're being asked to do it for 30, or they're being asked to do it for 4, or whatever the case may be. So, is it practical? You need to really think before you start taking marks off, because is it practical at Viewdemont where they've got 15 chefs in the kitchen? Probably is. Is it practical at Blackburn Pub where they've got 3 chefs? Probably not. So being practical is difficult. What I would sort of consider about being practical is it going to fall over when the waiter takes it out? Is it easy? Will my knife go through the Subway biscuit? All those sort of things. So that's probably where you'd be talking about food. Is it practical? Personal taste, try not to use